In the early 1960s, Boeing was not the dominant force in short-haul aviation. Its reputation was built on large, complex aircraft, the 707 for intercontinental routes, and soon the 727 for high-density domestic trunk lines. But below that sat a market Boeing had largely ignored: short, high-frequency routes between secondary cities, often less than 500 nautical miles apart, flown multiple times a day, where turnaround time, simplicity, and cost mattered more than speed or range. That market already had incumbents. Douglas had the DC-9, a clean-sheet design tailored specifically for short-haul operations, with rear-mounted engines, built-in stairs, and excellent performance from shorter runways. In Europe, the British Aircraft Corporation's 111 was selling well to flag carriers and emerging regional airlines alike. Both aircraft were lighter, simpler, and cheaper to operate than anything Boeing had on offer. Boeing knew it was late. The company's initial response wasn't innovation, it was containment. In 1964, under intense pressure from major customers like United Airlines and Lufthansa, Boeing authorized a rushed development program to produce a competitor quickly, cheaply, and with minimal internal disruption. That aircraft became the 737. From the start, the 737 was defined by compromise. To reduce development cost, Boeing reused as much of the 707 and 727 as possible. The fuselage cross-section was nearly identical, allowing 6 abreast seating and common cargo containers. Systems architecture, cockpit philosophy, and even some avionics concepts were borrowed directly from larger Boeing jets. This was not about optimizing the airplane, it was about minimizing change. One design decision would shape the 737's entire future: low ground clearance. Instead of tall landing gear and rear-mounted engines like the DC-9, Boeing placed the engines under the wing, close to the ground. This simplified structure, reduced weight, and allowed the aircraft to operate from smaller airports without expensive ground equipment. Baggage handlers could load cargo without belt loaders. Mechanics could service engines from the ramp. Airlines didn't need to rebuild infrastructure to support it. But this choice came with limits. Early 737-100 and 737-200 models were powered by Pratt & Whitney JT8D low-bypass turbofans, reliable but noisy, fuel-hungry, and increasingly constrained as airports began tightening noise regulations. The aircraft's short landing gear also meant there was little room for larger, more efficient engines in the future. At the time, that didn't matter. No one expected the 737 to need them. When the 737 entered service in 1968 with Lufthansa, it was not seen as a flagship. It was marketed as a utility jet, a replacement for turboprops and aging piston aircraft on short routes. Boeing itself positioned it as a supplement to the 727, not a successor. Internally, few executives believed it would ever become the backbone of airline fleets. The perception across the industry was similar. Compared to the DC-9, the 737 looked conservative. Compared to the 111, it looked American and oversized. It had no revolutionary aerodynamics, no breakthrough performance, no dramatic range advantage. On paper, it was simply adequate. And that was the point. The 737 was never designed to win the future. It was designed to survive the present, to keep Boeing relevant in a market it had arrived late to, using familiar tools, familiar systems, and familiar thinking. What no one understood at the time was that this ordinariness, this lack of ambition, would become its greatest strength. By the early 1970s, the 737 still hadn't won anything. Sales were steady but unremarkable, and the aircraft lived in the shadow of both the DC-9 and Boeing's own 727. What changed the trajectory of the program wasn't a single breakthrough, but a quiet series of decisions that reshaped how airlines thought about fleets, crews, and cost, decisions whose consequences wouldn't fully surface for decades. The first was certification philosophy. From the outset, Boeing treated the 737 not as a standalone product, but as a family with continuity baked in.
When the 737-200 evolved from the 100, Boeing resisted redesigning the cockpit or radically altering flight characteristics. Control forces, instrument layouts, system logic, and failure modes were intentionally preserved. This allowed regulators to grant common type ratings across variants, a powerful advantage that airlines immediately understood. A common type rating meant a pilot certified on one 737 could fly another with minimal additional training. In an era when simulator time was scarce, expensive, and increasingly regulated, this mattered. Airlines could upgrade fleets without retraining entire pilot groups. A captain flying a -200 could transition to later models with differences training instead of a full certification cycle. That translated directly into money saved and scheduling flexibility gained. Crew continuity extended beyond pilots. Cabin crew procedures, emergency equipment locations, door operations, and evacuation flows remained familiar across variants. Dispatchers, load planners, and ground crews worked with aircraft that behaved the same way operationally, even as capacity and performance incrementally improved. Every new 737 slotted into existing manuals instead of rewriting them.
Maintenance was where the lock-in became structural. Because Boeing preserved systems architecture, airlines reused tooling, spare parts inventories, diagnostic equipment, and technical expertise across decades. Hydraulic layouts, electrical buses, and environmental control logic evolved slowly, deliberately avoiding disruptive redesigns. A mechanic trained on early 737s could troubleshoot later models without relearning fundamentals. This continuity also shaped Boeing's relationship with suppliers. Component manufacturers optimized production around the 737's long life cycle. Landing gear assemblies, control actuators, avionics racks, and structural subassemblies benefited from volume stability rather than frequent redesign. As production rates climbed, unit costs dropped, not just for Boeing, but for airlines purchasing spares and support. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, this approach began to separate the 737 from competitors. Airbus, entering the market with the A320 family, pursued a clean sheet design, fly-by-wire controls, new cockpit philosophy, and advanced automation. Technically, it was impressive. Operationally, it demanded change. New training pipelines, new maintenance regimes, new cultural assumptions inside airlines. Many carriers hesitated, not because the A320 was inferior, but because switching imposed friction. The 737, by contrast, offered familiarity disguised as progress. The Classic series, -300, -400, -500, introduced CFM56 engines, better fuel burn, and higher payloads, while preserving enough commonality to keep training and maintenance costs contained. Later, the Next Generation series expanded range, wing area, and capacity, again without forcing airlines to break from the system they were already invested in. What emerged was a feedback loop. The more 737s an airline operated, the harder it became to justify leaving the ecosystem. Fleet planners favored incremental upgrades because they minimized risk. Finance departments preferred predictable depreciation and residual values. Operations managers valued aircraft that fit seamlessly into established schedules and crew rotations. Over time, the decision stopped being about performance. It became about inertia. Choosing the 737 was no longer an active endorsement. It was the default path of least resistance. Every new 737 wasn't a new airplane. It was an update airlines couldn't afford to reject. By the time competitors realized what this continuity had created, the lock-in was already complete.
By the mid-1990s, the contest had stopped resembling a traditional aircraft market. What existed instead was an industrial machine running at a speed no rival could safely match. Monthly output climbed steadily, first into the dozens, then beyond 40 airframes per month, eventually surpassing 50. At that pace, cost structures stopped behaving normally. Fixed expenses dissolved across thousands of deliveries. Margins widened without raising prices. Discounts became survivable. This cadence reshaped the entire supply chain. Component manufacturers aligned capital investments, tooling life cycles, and workforce planning around a single airframe family. Landing gear producers, avionics firms, fuselage fabricators, and engine suppliers optimized processes not for innovation cycles, but for uninterrupted throughput. Reliability improved not because designs were revolutionary, but because repetition eliminated variability. Problems serviced early, fixes propagated instantly, and learning curves flattened faster than competitors could react. Volume also rewrote financing. Leasing firms gained confidence in residual values backed by liquidity. Banks underwrote purchases knowing secondary markets would exist decades later. A narrow body no longer represented a gamble, it became an asset class. Smaller carriers gained access to favorable terms simply by aligning with the dominant platform. This forced strategic responses elsewhere. European manufacturers pivoted aggressively, consolidating efforts into a single family meant to counterbalance industrial momentum rather than out-engineer it. The resulting products introduced advanced systems and cleaner architectures, but entered a landscape where decisions were already constrained. Airlines evaluated spreadsheets, not spec sheets. Marginal gains in fuel burn struggled to offset ecosystem disruption. Operational departments leaned toward predictability. Network planners prioritized dispatch reliability. Training divisions resisted change. Procurement teams favored certainty over incremental efficiency. At sufficient magnitude, the dominant aircraft ceased being an option among many and became the reference point against which all others were measured.
Dominance carries a price. Sustaining continuity across half a century required concessions invisible in early decades but cumulative over time. Structural dimensions set in the 1960s constrained later growth. Ground clearance choices forced creative accommodations. Systems layering replaced holistic redesign. Each generation inherited assumptions it could not escape. Engineering teams managed evolution through adaptation rather than reinvention. Solutions optimized for compatibility introduced complexity elsewhere. What once simplified training later complicated certification. Incremental change preserved market position while narrowing technical margins. As reliance deepened, dependency followed. Airlines structured route networks, crew pipelines, and financial models around a single type. Manufacturers absorbed pressure to deliver upgrades without disruption. Regulators scrutinized changes more closely, aware that consequences extended far beyond one program. Success created fragility. When challenges emerged, their impact propagated instantly across fleets, schedules, and balance sheets worldwide. No alternative stood ready at equal scale. Replacement was theoretical, transition was impractical. The aircraft that achieved ubiquity reshaped aviation economics and then bound every participant to its trajectory. The 737 took over everything, but in doing so, it trapped both Boeing and the airlines inside its own success.